Another chance to see the award-winning trilogy Artists and Models, set in a Paris studio during a century of scandal and revolution. Part 1, starring James Lawrenson as Jacques-Louis David, The Passing Show.
During the time of the Great Terror in France, the most bloody days of the Revolution, a group of sans-culottes reenact in public the oath to the fatherland. Life imitates art. They are paying homage to a painting, the Oath of the Horatii. It has been adopted as a symbol and an inspiration for the Revolution. Its maker was the greatest painter of his day. He was also a political activist and a leading figure in Robespierre's secret police. His name was Jacques-Louis David, and he was to become one of the most revered and reviled figures in the history of art. But his story, and the story of 100 years of painting in France, begins during the lavish, decadent days of the old regime.
The degradation of morals has, as its consequence, the degradation of taste, of character, of expression, of colour, of composition.
The words of one of the first professional art critics, Diderot, on the work of his contemporaries, the artists of the Ancien Régime. Diderot goes on to attack one of the foremost painters of his day, the purveyor of naked nymphs and Venuses to the aristocracy, François Boucher.
I would go so far as to say that the notions of delicacy, decency, innocence, and simplicity are strangers to him. I would go so far as to say that this man is utterly without taste.
Boucher's most celebrated model, the girl known as Louison, a success story of the old regime told by an unexpected contributor to the history of art.
I had been to sup with my friend, Patou, at the house of an actress by the name of Victoria O'Murphy. Patou decided to devote himself to a more agreeable occupation, and I was left alone with the slovenly girl who was the youngest sister of the family. She led me to a corner of the room in which I saw a filthy pallet with unwashed sheets. I declined her offer, but on a sudden inspiration, suggested to her that she might still earn her money if she agreed to go to bed herself, as usual.
Why?
I want to watch you undress.
You won't do anything to me?
Not a thing.
My sister says that's worth 25 louis.
Does she indeed?
I might undress for a crown.
Do then. What is your name, child?
Mary Louise Murphy. Will you make it 2 crowns?
The girl was unwashed and unkempt, but gradually I saw emerge a figure that surpassed all that art and nature could possibly combine. Indeed, the chisel of Praxiteles had not carved a form more enchanting. I examined her with delight, and wishing to prove my taste as a connoisseur of female beauty, I decided I should display my discovery to an appreciative public.
Patu?
I conceived there and then the notion of possessing that beautiful form in a painted likeness, and we set to deciding upon a pose that would show the nether parts to the greatest advantage. An artist of my acquaintance agreed to do the picture splendidly for me for the sum of 6 louis, and one could not have wished for a more speaking likeness.
The model, Marie-Louise Murphy, became the celebrated Louison, mistress of King Louis XV. The artist, Francois Boucher, was appointed official painter to the King of France. When one of Boucher's followers, Jacques-Louis David, became virtual dictator of the arts in revolutionary France, he had the works of his former master removed from public exhibition. They said, David has put Boucher to the guillotine.
What seemed to me most important was to wait for a time when passions had cooled, for a time when the public might again be disposed to listen to my story.
Much of what we know of David was written down in a memoir after his death by one of his pupils.
I, Etienne Delecluse, and now myself become a painter of some obscurity, studied here at the school of David, and knew him as well as any man could. With these memories, I hope to bring alive again a great painter and the times in which he lived. For the genius and talent of David is like a mirror. It is with the same impassive eye that he has reproduced, almost as if he had no choice, every nuance of political and intellectual revolution that crossed the path of his own life. And his faults, too, for no great man is without them, seem to me not so much a weakness in his own character as a reflection of the extraordinary circumstances in which he found himself at different stages of his life. The work an artist does is indelibly marked by the events, the passions and prejudices, and even the errors of his own time. When the master was absent, the morning life class was invariably a scene of total chaos. We wasted all our time in minor scuffles and arguments. There were those who supported the Jacobins and those who opposed them, and we relied upon a network of spies along the corridor to keep us informed of David's approach.
Allons, pompe de la patrie, à la soirée, continue de la tyrannie, les condamnes sont go élevés, les condamnes sont go élevés.
But our wars were fought with jokes and games, and these little scenes in our studio were merely a parody of the far more serious events in the world outside. The memory of those bloody days is still alive in all of us who witnessed them. Those strange and terrible spectacles, the crowds spread out over the streets, your ears and eyes assaulted on all sides by chants, by shouts for death and revenge, by scenes of bloody violence. The lists of the condemned shouted out on the street corners. A little further off, toy guillotines on sale. Childhood being, as it is, without pity and charmed by the novelties of death.
What else do you sing, Ducis? Gluck, isn't it?
Yes, master.
Well, if you like him, I think the Italians are better. Careful of the arms, they're too heavy. And of course, if you prefer German music. Well, now you really do belong to the ancien regime. Your painting is like your hairstyle. You're out of your time, my friend, born either too early or too late.
To this day, I continue to be astonished by my recollection of this extraordinary man whose political reputation had transformed him into a kind of monstrous savage in the imagination of all those who had never actually known him. In reality, he had the most cultivated of manners. In his dress, in his whole person, there reigned the quality of a man of good company, in spite of a look that was a little hard and a tumour that disfigured the left side of his mouth. David was, in truth, a prominent member of the feared Committee for Public Security. He never denied it. But I can say now with absolute conviction that his concern there had been exclusively with matters relating to the arts.
But Delacluse was wrong. What he could never have known, for the documents only came to light a century later, was that during a period of 2 years, David had signed literally hundreds of warrants for the arrest of men and women denounced as enemies of the revolution. Many were tried and imprisoned, some were executed. David was later to deny he was ever responsible for the arrest of one single person.
Ah, Etienne. Monsieur Delacluse already convinced of his own genius.
No, master.
I have to repeat to you. I have to repeat, take care. It is not all in the head, genius. It must be cultivated like a...
Monsieur David was also afflicted with a marked impediment in his speech, for some of us the source of much cruel amusement.
It must be cultivated like a...
As a consequence of this affliction, he was in the habit of getting quite lost in the midst of his favourite homilies.
No, I don't know what I was talking about, but you understand me, Delacluse?
Yes, master.
Yes, master.
The figure is good. You should start painting. To seize. Please.
The time-honoured sanction for the more troublesome of the students was for Monsieur David to order him to take his turn on the rostrum in place of the model. These few little episodes I have selected from 1,000 like them. And if our daily life in the school seems hardly touched by the momentous events outside in which our master was playing such a part, you must understand that we were young then, and we saw in front of us not the man of politics, but the artist, the greatest in France, and the creator of a work that had changed the course of painting in our time, the magnificent Oath of the Horatii.
In a setting of cold, vaulted stone, darkness beyond, the figures frozen, it seems, in utter silence, the 3 sons of Horatius are swearing an oath to their father before they go out to do battle. David's characters are the very embodiment of the Roman virtues: proud, patriotic, fearless, impassive. In time, this will be adopted as the first image of the revolution. It's already itself a revolution in painting. And after the excesses of the old regime, now they say when you walk past a David, you can feel the chill wind blowing from it.
At this time, the taste for archaeological research and the achievements of antiquity was at the height of its fervour. The particular merit of David, and that which was to assure his fame, was to have been the first French artist to put into practice the theories of the antique which were being spread in Europe by the intellectuals of his time.
David had actually begun painting on the advice of François Boucher himself. His first attempt as a student at the coveted Prix de Rome was with a Boucher-inspired fantasy called The Combat of Mars and Minerva. He failed. Then the second year failed again and made a half-hearted suicide bid. He won the gold medal only at his third attempt, with The Sickness of Antiochus, and travelled to Rome to continue his studies.
Before he left for Italy, Monsieur David had said, "The antique will never seduce me. It lacks movement."
The funeral rites of Patroclus. Only a sketch, but a huge one, a lavish and operatic panorama. At this point in his career, David has been told to keep all his action on a single stage, advice that will stay with him for the rest of his life, as does his insistence on the study of the antique.
The frequent recommendations that David made to us to find inspiration among the ancient cultures did bear fruit. Indeed, were sometimes carried to the most rigorous extremes. If a number of others had not also seen the entrance one day of Ducis and Pierret, the one dressed as Agamemnon, the other as Paris, I would indeed fear being taxed with some exaggeration.
From what direction did you come to school this morning, Ducis? Through the Tuileries?
Yes, master.
And your walk, it was a pleasant one?
Yes, master.
Excellent. Continue.
The student's charade was nothing new. Delacluse reports that as early as the 1780s, a kind of mania for the antique had swept through Paris society.
After the appearance of the Oath of the Horatii, the styles of antiquity became à la mode, with David as the leader of fashion. It was all-pervasive, this infatuation, and however silly the idea might seem today, we all adopted Greek costume. Greek evenings were arranged with improvised Greek decor and refreshments.
And appropriate entertainments were provided on these occasions, often stage-managed by David himself. Pseudo-Greek poets read from the classics. This, The Death of Socrates, from Plato.
Then he who was the messenger of the 11 said to Socrates, "I am to order you to drink the hemlock, so farewell, and try to bear with courage what must be." And the messenger took his leave. Then Crito said, "The sun is still upon the mountain, and is not yet gone down. There is time." And Socrates said, "If the poison is prepared, bring me the cup." And then Apollodorus broke out with such a lamentation that his despair entered into all, except Socrates himself. A man should go to his death in peace and tranquility. Peace with you all. Be of courage. And he raised the cup and drank. Such was the end of Socrates, a man I would call the wisest, most just and best of all those I have ever known.
But do not be deceived by the childishness of these little games we were all playing then. For the sudden and all-pervasive infatuation with a new fashion is never a wholly disconnected event. Often it proves to be the harbinger of a far greater change in customs, in manners, and sometimes in the fabric of society itself.
And Delacluse adds a significant footnote to David's early paintings. Of the study of Paris and Helen, he writes,
"It was painted for the Comte d'Artois, the brother of the king."
For which reason it was judged prudent at the time not to exhibit it in public. The year was 1788. Another painting of a man and his muse from the same period, the portrait of the chemist Lavoisier and his wife. This painting, too, was hidden away from public view and, for reasons of politics, not explained at the time. Lavoisier was one of France's most eminent scientists, but one particular aspect of his researches had made him an object of suspicion.
Equal parts sulfur and nitrate do not produce any kind of explosion in vacuo. The sulfur sublimed like the phosphorus.
For the chemist, Lavoisier was also the manufacturer of ammunition for the military and owner of the gunpowder monopoly for the whole of France. To the people, he'd become one of the symbols of their oppression.
Experiment 3. Some gunpowder was placed under the receiver of an air pump, and as perfect a vacuum made as could possibly be effected.
Shortly after the Lavoisier portrait was completed, one of his munition factories blew up, killing many. Lavoisier himself narrowly escaped death. An angry crowd made an attempt to capture and lynch him. The time was not judged propitious for David's painting to be shown, and now the whole of France was becoming increasingly restless. From the 19th century historian Michelet.
It was a time of sudden storms, of false alarms, and full of anxiety like a feverish, painful dream. The ground itself was burning as if mined deep by explosives, and you could already sense the rumbling of the volcano that was soon to erupt. Cannon frowned upon Paris and, already loaded, thrust their menacing jaws from the battlements of the Bastille. There, the arsenal had gunpowder and ammunition enough to destroy a city.
July the 14th, 1789, the fall of the Bastille.
All members of this National Assembly will now take a solemn oath to gather together whenever circumstances demand until the Constitution of the realm has been consolidated on firm foundations.
On June the 17th, 1789, the Third Estate, in a bid to reduce the power of the ruling class, had formed themselves into a National Assembly, meeting at Versailles. 3 days later, the King had the doors of their meeting place locked against them. At 10:30 a.m., one of the members, the celebrated Monsieur Guillotin, suggested they should reassemble in the Royal Tennis Court. And there, the historic Oath of the Tennis Court was taken by several hundred members. One of them, a Jacobin, made a further suggestion.
Let the most powerful brush, the most skillful engraving tool, pass on to our grandchildren what France has done for them today, after 10 centuries of oppression.
David worked meticulously for months. He visited the courts and made drawings with scribbled notes on colour and design. As was his custom, his characters were drawn first as nude figures. Later, he will add their clothing, contemporary dress, not the costumes of Roman heroes, but heroes they were to be, nonetheless. As time goes by, the rapidly changing circumstances of the revolution begin to cause delays and problems. Delacluse explains.
Most of the men who should have figured as heroes in the Oath of the Tennis Court, if they were not already discredited as traitors, had become at least the objects of general suspicion.
David begins to rewrite history. Some of his discredited heroes are expunged from the sketches. Others who had not been present but who had since risen to power were added. After 3 years' work, he writes a despairing note.
Unfortunately, I can no longer see any of the legislative body of the time being of any importance to posterity.
Finally, he abandons the painting altogether. But the revolution needed its heroes, needed leaders, needed ideas, needed models. Amid scenes of pandemonium, on January the 17th, 1790 in Paris, a performance of Voltaire's Brutus in front of a mixed audience of royalists and republicans.
The fight for our freedom is yours to command. You are its father. Speak, Brutus, for us.
Voltaire's drama of the conflict between monarchy and republicanism was interrupted so often that the performance lasted twice its normal length. A Paris newspaper had even printed a guide to the lines that might be cheered or booed by either faction.
It is not time. Each state has its laws, which it holds to by nature or changes by choice. Slaves of their kings and slaves of their priests, the people seem born to serve under a master. But pardon, great gods, if the people of Rome have waited too long to rise against Tarquin. In the heart of Rome, if you find one traitor that grieves for his king and would follow a master, let him die a death full of torture. Romans, keep watch.
For Rome, we heard France, all of us who were spectators that night, and there were loud cries from all quarters of the audience. The French people wants its Brutus. Monsieur David, whose patriotism is equal to his genius, had placed on the stage an antique bust of the Roman hero.
1 year before, David wrote in a letter,
I'm doing a picture which is purely my own invention. It is Brutus, the man and father who has deprived himself of his own children and withdrawn to his home. As he sits grieving, he is distracted by the cries of his wife and daughters.
Brutus, the first consul, the ultimate patriot, has had his own sons executed for conspiracy against the state. David's painting places him in the shadows, stoical and silent, while the bodies are brought in. Delacluse writes,
once again, the great influence of this painting on the taste and fashion of the time was immediately seen. Women, and soon after men, began to wear their hair in looser, more flowing styles. Instead of the rounded contours of the furniture of the old regime, more severe styles appeared in their stead. The first cause of these changes was undoubtedly the great political revolution which had already begun. But what had happened in the arts had been a powerful inspiration.
Rome only is my care. My heart knows none but her.
And for the historic stage performance, Monsieur David himself designed many of the costumes and stage furnishings.
My lord, my son is no more. It is done. And my eyes... Rome is free. It is enough. Give thanks to the gods.
And the audience saw in the final scene the leading actor fall into a pose that was a deliberate reference to the work of his friend, David.
The applause was deafening as the spectators recognized this homage paid by one art form to another at the end of an evening where art and politics came together. By the finish of Voltaire's even-handed debate, the revolutionaries were cheering the loudest. David himself had managed to suppress one fact about his painting of Brutus. It had been commissioned for the king. David was still being patronized by the royal family, even into the first years of the revolution. Among his proposals for royal portraits, one advanced the unfortunate notion of a sword of Damocles suspended over the king's head. The painting was not commissioned. He'd begun studies for a portrait of Louis showing to the young Dauphin the new constitution that he'd finally accepted and signed in 1791. David later denied he'd ever made this sketch. After continued royalist insurrections, the king and queen are imprisoned and the monarchy dissolved. The fever of stripping royal and aristocratic power mounts. David attends a meeting of the National Convention on January the 16th, 1793, and makes a public commitment there that will dog his reputation for the rest of his life.
To the motion that the sentence of death on the king be commuted to internment for life.
No.
To the motion that the matter of the death sentence upon the king be submitted to the public in a referendum.
No.
Louis XVI is executed on the 21st of January, 1793. David is one of the signatories of the death warrant.
I have seen this bestial David, his face so stamped with the mark of wickedness. No one looks more evil, no one more diabolically ugly. If he is not hanged, you can no longer judge a man by his face.
And so began the epoch of the Great Terror, where our master's name found itself so unhappily inscribed. At the National Convention, he was made responsible for reorganizing the arts. There, we were told, he appeared to be in a state of constant excitability, his stammered speeches interminable and largely incomprehensible. And on occasions, at least one of his political obsessions did surface in the classroom.
Master, I can't stay like this for long.
Shall we tie strings to your limbs to hold you up like a pulcinella? That's what they would do at the academy. They'd prop them up with blocks and tie their hands and feet. The academy treats painting like a job of work.
When he held, in his turn, the presidency of the convention, Monsieur David wasted no time in using his power to urge the destruction of the Royal Academy. Its doors closed in 1793, and thereafter the dictatorship of the arts in all France devolved on one man, David himself.
I have promised to make public the damage the men of the Academy do to the art they profess. And I keep my word. You were at the Academy. The torso looks like a plucked chicken. A bad school is like a wig maker's shop. You cannot enter it except with the sure knowledge that you will come out with white powder all over your clothes.
David's dictatorship aimed to democratize the arts. He wiped out the traditional competitions that made or broke a young painter's career. He dismissed the old guard in the museums and drew up lists of acceptable items in the national heritage. In his school, too, he'd broken with tradition. Women were allowed into the same classes as male students, though he defended himself carefully by pointing out that they were segregated in a different part of the classroom. In a prison of their own, he put it. He was spending less and less time now on his teaching and none on his own painting. Even his students began to notice that politics took precedence over everything.
I have no time.
Now he has aligned himself with the rising star, Robespierre. In 1793, he becomes a member of the infamous Committee for Public Security.
Pluviot's 23rd warrant for the arrest of the Comte de Zoicourt and his wife. Fontainebleau's 12th warrant for the arrest and confinement of Louis de Champernay, governor of the Tuileries. Fontainebleau's 19th mandate for the arrest and interrogation of citizeness Marie-Laurence Collonges. Prairial's 17th mandate for the arrest...
It is less than 3 years since he has made some of his finest portraits of women of the aristocracy. The Comtesse de Saucy-Telusson, 1790. The Marquise d'Auvilliers, 1790. Portrait of Madame de Pastoret, 1791. But the backgrounds are troubled, and some of the works are unfinished. Portrait of Madame de Trudaine de Montigny, 1792. Madame de Trudaine went to the guillotine with her husband. Madame de Pastoret was arrested and imprisoned during the Revolution. The jails begin to overflow. At the women's prison of Saint-Pélagie, amongst the wives of aristocrats and royalists, there are others: nuns, actresses, prostitutes. One prisoner here in 1793 is a now forgotten celebrity from the days of the old regime. Once she was the mistress of the King of France. Before that, a famous painter's model. Her name is Marie-Louise Murphy. And the most famous woman prisoner of the Revolution, Queen Marie Antoinette, will follow her husband to the guillotine. David draws her on the way to the scaffold, stripped of her finery, and even her false teeth. He prowls the streets, too, during the terrible massacres of 1792. His subjects, the dead and the dying. A passer-by who doesn't recognize him asks what he's doing.
I am capturing the last movements of nature in these criminals.
And the man says as he walks away, "You disgust me." Robespierre's Committee for Public Security is all-powerful. Thousands are condemned at the tribunals. And as internecine struggles break out at the Assembly, the guillotine will claim the heads of revolutionaries as well as royalists. In time, Danton, Saint-Just, and Robespierre himself will all die. Others will fall not at the hands of their peers, but through the obsessions of individuals.
Now the first Brutus was a man of courage and resolution, but hard like a sword of tempered steel.
In the summer of 1793, a young woman from Caen travels to Paris and takes a room at the Hôtel de la Providence. She calls a hairdresser to her room on the afternoon of Saturday, July the 13th.
Marcus Brutus was a descendant of that Junius Brutus, but he was careful always to moderate the instincts of nature by the natural disciplines of philosophy.
She has brought with her to Paris her copy of Plutarch's Lives of the Romans, a sealed letter addressed to the French people, and her birth certificate. During the week, she has been shopping for a new dress. It was said to be of muslin patterned with spots, with a dark jacket, pink neckscarf, and a tall black bonnet with a green cockade. She has also visited an ironmonger in the arcades of the Palais Royal, where she has selected and bought a medium-sized kitchen knife. This she wraps in her birth certificate.
Marcus Brutus knew at this time that the safety of Rome depended upon his conduct, and since he knew well the danger this presented, he strove to keep his plans to himself and his thoughts secret in his own bosom.
At 7 p.m., Charlotte Corday took a cab to Rue des Cordeliers, the apartments of Jean-Paul Marat. The events that followed were reenacted the next day in the National Assembly in a bravura performance by Deputy Chabot.
And citizens of the Assembly, this woman of vile reputation and murderous intent arrived at the chambers of Citizen Marat, inveigled her way into his presence with false depositions, approached him with these live words. I have secret things to tell you.
I have secret things to tell you that are vital to the safety of the Republic. I am being persecuted for the sake of liberty. I am wretched. That alone gives me the right to your protection.
It is enough that I am truly wretched, that I should have the right to your protection. Then, citizens, she raised the assassin's knife and stood over Citizen Marat's helpless body. In vain, he tried to defend himself against the murderous blow. As Citizen Marat called for aid, to me, friends, the assassin struck and pierced his breast, and his lifeblood flowed from his body. The traitress made no attempt to move, but stood on that spot, the bloody weapon in her hand, until she was arrested. Where are you, David? There is one more painting for you to do.
And David, who was present, called out, "I will do it." 3 months later, David exhibits at his own studio his masterpiece, the painting of Marat assassinated. Next to it, he puts on show the actual bathtub in which Marat died. David's requiem for a dead hero is accompanied by his arrangements for Marat's funeral. He plans to exhibit the body in public, naked like the warriors of antiquity. However, he writes, "As you know, parts of his skin are inflamed with a kind of leprosy, so we've had to change the plans. We will have to show him covered with a damp cloth, which will be wetted from time to time to prevent putrefaction." The pagan funeral rites and festivals of antiquity are revived in revolutionary France. The fantasy of the artist is to be made real, dramatized for the edification of the people. With the suppression of organized religion, new martyrs, new figures of worship are required. Those of the revolution who fall beneath the assassin's knife are cast in these roles. Le Pelletier de Saint-Fargeau, said to be one of the ugliest men in France. David's pencil transforms him into a Christ figure for the revolution. A young boy, Barras, surrounded by royalist soldiers, refuses to shout "Long live the King" and is cut down. David paints the young Barras, nude, androgynous, an angel for the revolution. These public ceremonies and funerals turned into huge popular festivals, pageants organized and stage managed by David. Using street plans and models, he worked out their itineraries and designed the huge set pieces and ornamental carriages. Delacluse was present at the first of the great festivals, the transfer of Voltaire's remains to the Panthéon.
The new society aimed to expunge organized religion. Now a new orthodoxy was invented to suit the times, designed once more around the all-consuming taste for the antique.
And David, the stage manager, became costume designer too, commissioned to create a new look for the officials of the Republic. An English traveller visited his studio at this time.
The painter's conception of a Republican dress rather resembles an old Spanish costume. blue jacket and trousers, white coat, scarlet cape, and a hat amply supplied with plumage. I believe the fashion did not catch on. Monsieur Talma acted as mannequin, a person of a very warlike stature. I took him at least for a major of dragoons. On further inquiry, I found out he was a miniature painter.
The day-long pageants become more and more lavish. David designs a series of colossal public monuments to replace the statues of the old regime and to line the routes of his processions. There are patriotic addresses at street corners, tributes to the heroes of the revolution in music and dance. There's the Festival of Liberty, the Festival of Brotherhood, the Festival of the Victory of Toulon, and the biggest of them all, the Festival of the Supreme Being. The climax of David's pageant is to be the appearance of Robespierre himself, dressed rather disconcertingly as a high priest. Robespierre had used his Committee of Public Security to consolidate his own position and to engineer the death of Danton and others who'd opposed him. But in his turn, he too was threatened in the convention, and he ended his final speech, "All that is left for me is to drink the hemlock."
No, no! If you drink the hemlock, I will drink it with you.
The day after his ill-advised outburst, Monsieur David stayed at home and did not attend at the National Assembly.
By order of the Committee for Public Security, I have a warrant for the arrest of Jacques-Louis David.
What seems like a courageous defense of his hero was regarded by his contemporaries as a typically foolhardy act of impetuousness, David in his state of delirium. He was imprisoned at the Hôtel des Fermes. Meanwhile, Robespierre had been deposed and was under sentence of death. After a time, David was allowed drawing materials and even models to visit him in his cell. His wife, who is seldom mentioned in accounts of David's life, had divorced him during his most feverish period of revolutionary activity. Now she was moved to visit him, and there was a reconciliation. But the time was approaching for David to answer the charges against him.
Yesterday, I was denounced at the National Convention in a calumny consisting of 17 accusations. And by the evening, the authors of this admirable composition had my crimes shouted aloud in the streets and printed in the newspapers.
David publishes his replies, denying that he had played any kind of active part in the Committee for Public Security, claiming he was put there only to make up the numbers, refuting the charges that he used his position to arrest, harass, or intimidate his enemies. His printed replies are full of confidence, even bravado.
Yes, slanderers. I will pursue you in my turn. It is in vain you seek to surround yourself with darkness. I will carry a lamp to shine into the most hidden recesses of your hearts. I will imprint on your own foreheads the hideous image of the crimes within you.
But David is to appear at a public examination, and there's one vital question he has left unanswered. Delacluse records the event as he saw it.
I walked into the tribunal at the very moment David stood to defend himself. There I saw the greatest artist in France menaced by the nearness of his own death.
We call upon David to answer directly. On the night of the 8th Thermidor, at the precise moment when Robespierre descended from the rostrum after his last traitorous address, did not David run to embrace him, and did he not call out to him, "I will drink the hemlock with you"?
It was not to support Robespierre that I went to his side that night. It was to ask for a delay in the hour of the festival of Barras, for it to be put forward from 10 o'clock, which is too early. I did not embrace Robespierre. I did not touch him. I did say I would drink the hemlock with him. I was not the only man to be deceived by him. he made a speech in which I heard him mention my name. I thought it was a joke. I joined in. Astonished when I heard I'd been reported to the tribunal the next day.
And did not David, in his cowardice, absent himself from that hearing on the following day and hide himself at his home, awaiting the outcome of the battle?
I was ill. I had to stay at home. I took an emetic at 9 o'clock in the morning and I could not go out. I had to stay at home. As to Robespierre, you cannot imagine how I was deceived by that wretched man. He led me as...
His stammer grew worse as the accusations proceeded. He became all but incoherent, and the sweat began to roll from his brow to the floor and make large stains there.
He led me astray with his hypocrisy. He betrayed my trust. I beg you to believe that I would prefer death to the torments I'm suffering at this moment. No man can condemn me as much as I condemn myself.
Robespierre and his closest allies go to the guillotine. David is spared and returned to prison for 5 months. His life saved, perhaps, by his very incoherence. Certainly his contemporaries never seemed to regard him as a significant force in politics.
I founded a great school. The whole of Europe came to see my paintings.
In prison, he makes his only landscape painting, a view from his cell window of the Luxembourg Gardens. And he makes a vow. In future, I shall put my faith only in causes and not in men.
Curious, yes? About General Bonaparte, well, I would tell you, my friends, what a fine head it is. It's pure, it's beautiful like an antique statue. Kind of profile you could carve on a medallion. He is a man to whom they would have raised altars in the old days. Yes, my dear friends, he is a hero. Bonaparte is my hero.
The first consul Bonaparte crossing the Great Saint Bernard, 1797. David paints Napoleon crossing the Alps, magnificent on a white charger, a thunderstorm darkening the sky. The actual journey was accomplished on a mule on a fine summer's day.
Regrettably, Napoleon proved to be an unreliable and often reluctant sitter. I was in the studio while Monsieur David was executing a portrait of the first consul, and in the great man's absence, the uniform which he had worn at Marengo was put at David's disposal. We dressed these clothes onto a mannequin. I'd been examining with a fascinated curiosity these mute witnesses to a great victory, the very hat, the very coat that the great man had worn, when David, whose good humour at times tended to lapse into the puerile, happened to observe.
They say that men of great power invariably possess large extremities.
They certainly have big heads.
Like his mentor, Boucher, David will be appointed first painter to the ruler of France. In a life-size portrait, he dramatizes what he describes as the moment when, at 4:13 in the morning, having been absorbed all night in his documents, Napoleon finally notices it is dawn and rises to review his troops. This portrait pleases his great patron. Others will be rejected as not to Napoleon's taste. Other subjects, though less eminent, were to prove quite as difficult. David had a fine couch made by the designer Jacob and placed beside it an antique oil lamp. This was to be the simple and elegant setting for a portrait of the society beauty, Madame Recamier. She sent David a message: "I am at your command for the sittings." On the many occasions when Madame Recamier didn't keep her appointments, David set a student to work on poses for the painting, drawing from a nude model. These are two of the sketches he made of a pose which was to feature again, with distinction, in the history of art. For the name of the pupil was Jean-Auguste Ingres. The young Ingres also worked on details in the finished painting. By his own account, certainly, he painted in the oil lamp. On the few occasions when Madame Recamier did put in an appearance, David managed to make a start on the portrait. He sketched in the fine drapery and the simple dress. In Recamier herself, he revealed a natural, vulnerable face behind the facade of the famous beauty. Then he said he wanted to start again. He had placed her against a dark background, almost black. He wasn't happy with the effect. Nor was Madame Recamier. Perhaps she decided David's likeness of her was too sombre for her taste, not flattering enough. She went to the painter Gérard, who did a more glamorous likeness of her. David heard of this rival portrait and wrote to her,
"Madame, painters too have their little whims. I shall leave your portrait unfinished."
Throughout his career, and through all the political turmoil of the past 20 years, David had painted portraits of his contemporaries. He seems to have regarded portraiture as merely a job of work, but these pictures, too, are a mirror of the changing times through which he lived. In the days of the old regime, an early masterpiece, the portrait of Count Potocki. From the same period, the celebrated architect Des Maisons, surrounded by the instruments of his profession and dressed like an aristocrat. And in her finery, David's own mother-in-law, Madame Pécule. The family of Camille Desmoulins. The journalist Desmoulins, a friend and supporter of Danton, was himself to go to the guillotine. So was the chemist Lavoisier. During the Revolution, David works entirely for the state, portraits of its heroes and martyrs. One private painting, the self-portrait done at the end of his political career in prison. And at the end of the Great Terror, a new mood under the government of the Directoire, and David returns to his work as a portraitist of friends and patrons. Madame de Cerizia, 1795. Monsieur de Cerizia, 1795. (1799), the new sense of freedom reflected in the flowing robes of Madame de Vernignac. Her younger brother, born the year before, is called Eugène de la Croix. David, urged to exhibit this beautiful portrait in public, replies,
"Why should I? I am a history painter."
Since the fall of Robespierre, the terrors of persecution and even death had been tempered by a new government. A new mood of tranquility, of liberty, allowed us to devote ourselves again to the distractions and pleasures of the intellect and the spirit. This new gaiety was reflected in both the fashions and manners of society. I had been working all morning making sketches in the studio when I was interrupted by the arrival of the Mesdemoiselles Bellegarde. I became entirely distracted by their presence, and yet unable to speak a word to them. My apprehension increased when I heard them approach me from behind, for both were exceedingly well-formed and dressed with all the freedom that the new fashions allowed. After being inundated with long hair, both dark and blonde, I was further embarrassed to experience the frankness with which the young ladies of society could now express themselves.
If one were to pose for Monsieur David's leading character, one would be obliged to reveal the bosom thus.
Mademoiselle Bellegarde. Mademoiselle, with your permission.
The word had been spread in society that Monsieur David was seeking a model for the central figure in his new painting of the Sabine women. Even ladies of rank may be seduced by the attentions of a celebrated artist.
I think Mademoiselle Aurore. May I offer some refreshments?
Hersilia is a woman of the Sabine tribe, the central character in David's drama of the intervention of the Sabine women. She throws herself between two opposing armies to prevent them doing battle. Even in these new times, David hopes the picture will be seen as a radical departure. He writes in the catalogue,
"When I did the Horatii and the Brutus, I was under the influence of Rome. Now I am reviving the principles of the ancient Greeks. It will shock many people. The horses will have neither bridles nor reins, and all the figures will be nude."
All the figures except Hersilia, that is, and perhaps inevitably, she is fated to become a model for fashion.
The figure is not naked. The hair is quite pleasing.
And Delacluse reports,
Mademoiselle Bellegarde was far from ashamed of her celebrity as a model. Indeed, she affected to appear at the theatre wearing the coiffure of Hersilia.
The Parisian theatre, too, was moving with the times. A new spirit of levity, even of satire, had begun to appear on the public stage, and no one was safe.
And we are approaching, my child, the flower of French art, your heritage. You shall see the newest work by the supreme master of the modern school, the emperor of painting, Monsieur David. Oh, dear.
This gentleman is very fine, Mamma.
Yes, my dear.
He appears to have no clothes, Mamma. All the gentlemen are quite bare.
And as David's Horatii had once been celebrated in public, so now was his Sabine picture. But the burlesque put on by the Comédie Française on March the 30th, 1800, and called The Painting of the Sabines, was something less than a homage.
Are you a connoisseur, mademoiselle?
No, sir, I'm a virgin.
But you love beautiful things.
True, sir, but...
Should these lovely arms embrace a counterfeit? What with these sweet lips on polished marble.
Mama, I found a real one.
There was some serious debate about the innovations of David's latest work, but from the critics too, the painting attracted its share of derision. The writer Stendhal later pointed out the absurdity of going into battle with no clothes on. Napoleon himself is reported to have disliked the picture intensely. David said, "These emperors, what do they know of painting?" For Napoleon, first consul of France had indeed decided to crown himself emperor in a magnificent ceremony in Notre Dame. The interior of the cathedral was to be completely redecorated for the occasion, and David, who was commissioned to record the event in a monumental painting, attended a rehearsal where he sketched in the major participants. His preparations were meticulous, as usual. He had constructed a model of the nave of the cathedral. He used dolls dressed in miniature costumes sewn by a Madame Manger, and with these he experimented with groupings and perspective. He had to account for his own point of view at the ceremony, which would be partially obscured by some of the dignitaries. One of them, Napoleon's own brother Joseph, wrote David an injured letter of complaint when he discovered he'd been totally omitted from the final composition. Napoleon, too, had his problems. Years before, he'd married his future empress in a civil ceremony. Now his most eminent guest, Pope Pius VII, had arrived in Paris to officiate at the coronation, and he discovered quite by chance that in the eyes of the church, Napoleon and Josephine were not man and wife. The only diplomatic solution to Napoleon's intense irritation was a hurriedly arranged church wedding on the very eve of the coronation. Early the next morning, December the 2nd, 1804, the clouds were dark and it had been raining heavily throughout the night. But report has it that when Napoleon arrived at Notre Dame to be crowned Emperor of France, the clouds parted and the skies began to clear.
When the Emperor saw the Sacre de Josephine, he said to David, "This is not a painting. You can walk right into it." Monsieur David worked for 3 years on this picture with a scrupulous attention to detail. He invited many of the participants to his studio during the months following the ceremony to sit in costume for their portraits. When they could not attend in person, he asked them to send him miniature paintings of their faces to copy. And from the High Chamberlain, Talleyrand, he obtained permission to borrow the imperial robes, which he had brought to the studio and, as was his custom, dressed onto dummies.
The great painter of the Revolution was now the enthusiastic recorder of an opulence and splendor which hadn't been seen since the days of the old regime. Napoleon visited him in his studio while the work was in progress and said to him of the Sacre de Josephine, "It is good, David, very good. You have read my thoughts. You have made me into a French knight." the words of a 19th century writer, Charles Clément. In 1812, the French people believed only in victory. By 1814, we could think of nothing but defeat. Leonidas at Thermopylae. The warriors rest before the final battle in which they will all perish. David said, "I want to paint what the Greeks saw as that moment of absolute calm before or after the crisis." Napoleon, when he studied the Leonidas, is reported to have been troubled by a strange premonition, and he saw the picture again after his return from Elba, the 100 Days, and said, "Shame on the vanquished." The final downfall of the most powerful man in Europe was also an ending for David. Once he had said,
"What painter, what poet is so happily placed as I am? I shall slip into history under the shadows of my heroes."
Paris was dangerous again. And under a restored monarchy, we saw the infamous Article 7 come into being. All signatories of the king's death warrant were to be exiled in perpetuity. I know that it was suggested to Monsieur David that because of his position, the article might be waived in his case, but he himself insisted that the decree be carried out. The night before they left France, I dined with Monsieur and Madame David. Not a word was spoken about what was to be. When we parted, for the first time ever, David embraced me.
I was old enough to know what I was doing. I did not act on impulse. Time will reveal the truth. I can rest now. My conscience is clear. I have kept to my side of the bargain.
I founded a great school.
From the very day after he left France, the school and all the precepts of Monsieur David were almost universally rejected.
In exile for the last 9 years of his life, David continues to paint portraits, but his obsession with the antique leads him into less and less prepossessing cloudscapes with nude goddesses, leering cupids, and languid psyches. Mars, the god of war, is disarmed by Venus. One of his later paintings tells a story with a familiar ring, the picture of Apelles and Campaspe. The Emperor Alexander commissions his leading artist Apelles to paint his favorite slave girl, Campaspe. The model is the possession of the patron, being recorded naked for him as an erotic souvenir. It is as if time has gone backwards to that vanished world of Boucher, Fragonard, and their like, or perhaps forward to the slaves and odalisques of David's most famous pupil, Ingres. David dies, still in exile, in 1825, at the age of 76. His pupil, Ingres, is already an accomplished master, and he will inherit, for a time at least, the role of first painter of France, for a new generation.
Art is more than a profession. It is an apostleship. And after the days of darkness, the light will come. All courageous work has its reward.